Thank you. And we're going to welcome Fintan up, who works with the Irish Environmental Network. He's Agriculture and Land Use Policy Officer. And Fintan's going to set the scene for us a little bit. So he's going to talk about what's going on in the bigger picture of biodiversity in Ireland, in Europe and globally. And specifically, he's going to introduce us to some of the policy responses that are out there and that are happening, like the Nature Restoration Law, Common Agricultural Policy, the Forestry Strategy. And these are the policies, they're the big picture things that are shaping our response to the crisis that we're seeing in biodiversity. So thank you, Fintan.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that intro, Anya. I'm actually not going to do a lot of the things Anya said I'm about to do, so I'll say that from the outset. Tom basically told me I had to have a lot of slides. They had to have a lot of very interesting pictures. I can't have any text to fall back on, which is what I usually do. So I thought, okay, I'll look really hard for some really nice pictures, and I was really excited about it. And I showed it to my wife, and she said, "That's really depressing." She says, "You have to warn people." So, like, you've been brought in here with a promise, a headline of the birds and the bees, and now you've got a guy from Roscommon who's going to be talking to you about biodiversity loss, mass extinction events. So you've been warned. First 5 minutes, really depressing. Last 5 minutes, I'm going to try and pick up the energy, less facts, and try and make it a bit more interesting. So we go to the first slide, or this is the intro slide. Next slide, Lisa. Thanks a lot. Okay, so every good story needs a beginning, and I decided that the beginning of this story is going to be the very beginning. So we're going to go back to the beginning of life on Earth. So stick with me. So 4 billion, 3.5 billion years ago, the first single-celled organisms appeared in the primordial ocean of the world. And over time, these evolved, diversified, gave rise to more complex life forms. And here we are today with the beautiful myriad of life we have on this earth that sustains our human civilization. But this process of evolution hasn't been a constant march of life conquering death over human history, or over geological history, really. Life has had a series of very serious setbacks. Scientists have identified at least 5 mass extinction events. So this is a period in geological time, a relatively short period, where over 75% of life on the Earth has totally disappeared. So some of the greatest hits of mass extinction events would include the late Devonian mass extinction event, which resulted in the loss of 75% of all species on Earth. The worst mass extinction event ever was the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which wiped out 96% of all marine life and 70% of life on land. It's called the Great Dying, for all the emos in the house. The most famous mass extinction event of all is, of course, the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction event, when an asteroid whacked into the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs. An event that has been mourned to this day by all dinosaur-loving children, including myself. And these dramatic changes in the history of life on Earth, of course, every cloud has a silver lining because they give the opening for a change. There was the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which obviously opened the door for the dinosaurs. And then the Cretaceous-Paleogene, of course, gave rise to the mammals. And here we all are today, the very smart primates that we are. So why am I going back this far? I think it's good to reflect on this and to point out that these were all extreme natural events. So we're talking about things like super volcanoes, extreme climate change, both extreme warming and extreme cooling, and also catastrophic changes to ocean circulation, which effectively resulted in all of marine life pretty much suffocating. Human civilization has obviously never been around for any of these mass extinction events, and human civilization would not survive any of these mass extinction events. So I suppose they occur naturally. So one way you could look at them, they're a bit like a plague. They happen, but you don't want to be around when one happens, and you definitely do not want to be responsible for a plague. But scientists are now telling us that humans are responsible for the start of a 6th mass extinction event that we're currently living through. So how long has this been going on for? It turns out it's actually been going on for a very long time. Pretty much as soon as our ancestors left Africa. We can see that when our hunter-gatherer our ancestors went to the other continents, and that coincided with a collapse in biodiversity, and in particular megafauna, which is a fancy word for just big animals. So it turns out that us humans, or at least our ancestors, were effectively super predators. So if you were a woolly mammoth in Europe, if you were a mastodon in North America, or if you were a giant ground sloth in South America, Our ancestors were a bit like a cross between Ridley Scott's Alien and Predator. We're just really effective at wiping out these big animals. And then that has had a knock-on impact to this day on ecosystem functioning and whatnot. So I suppose if our ancestors were super predators, we are ecosystem engineers on a massive scale. We've reshaped the planet to suit our own needs and particularly to suit our own consumption demands and our demands for cheap food and particularly meat. So this is WWF have been tracking trends in wildlife for the last 50 years, particularly focusing on vertebrate wildlife. So this is things with spines. They're quite easy to monitor, or relatively easier to monitor. So things like reptiles, fish, amphibians, and mammals. And what we can see is that in the global south, in particular, the mega biodiverse areas around the equator, there's been a really dramatic drop in those populations since the 1950s. In the global north, the drop hasn't been as dramatic, but you have to bear in mind that we've been massively impacting on nature since the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of the impacts that are happening in the global south, they're a result of our consumption demands. So our demands for things like timber, for food products, for mining products, metals, etc., everything that support our lifestyles. The main drivers of biodiversity loss internationally are habitat loss and degradation, overexploitation, and then climate change is becoming a bigger driver as time progresses. So when we talk about habitat destruction, we're talking about things like, the clearance of the Amazon to make way for livestock farming, habitat degradation, things like in Ireland, where we're seeing a lot of agriculture intensification, and overexploitation. We're talking about things like overfishing of the sea. And a lot of these can be drawn directly back to increasing demand for cheap food, and in particular for meat. So I suppose that was we went back to the very beginning, and then inevitably I have to bring it home to Ireland. So Ireland is an island, it's a bit of a microcosm throughout our history of all these sort of trends. In Ireland, you can see throughout our history our capacity of humanity to positively impact on biodiversity and negatively impact on biodiversity. So when our Neolithic ancestors first arrived in Ireland, they would have encountered a primeval forested landscape. It's hard to even comprehend what this would have looked like because these kind of old growth forests don't really exist anymore. You'd have to go to places like Poland, like Biodiversity, to see what they really look like. And though our Neolithic farming ancestors began clearing those ancient oak woodlands, and over time that process progressed, and then it peaked around the time of the Great Famine when forest cover reduced in the country to just 1%. And today, only about 1 to 2% of our country is covered in native woodlands. Other habitats, Ireland is the worst record in the world when it comes to wetland loss. So over the last 300 years, we have lost 90% of our wetlands, and only 20% of our peatlands are considered intact. So we've gone from a primeval landscape, covered a lot in ancient old growth woodlands, a lot of expansive mosaics of wetlands in the Midlands and the West, to a very modified landscape. Of course, the loss of these habitats would have driven the loss of a lot of species. So a lot of charismatic species people mightn't even have realised were once in Ireland. Things like wolves, lynx, wild boar, common crane, osprey. The list, I could go on and on. So then I suppose moving forward to more modern times, one of the big problems now is that agricultural intensification and land use intensification. So we used to have a lot of semi-natural grasslands. We've intensified the use of them, putting on fertilizer to grow grass quicker, to produce more milk, to produce more beef, to produce more lamb. And that's resulted in a loss of biodiversity across the board. We have quite an intensive forestry model, I'm sure you're all aware of, the Sitka spruce monoculture kind of model that's clear-felled. And then our peatlands and our wetlands, we haven't been good to them either through industrial and domestic turf cutting. So yeah, and you can see it's this is a satellite representation of land cover in Ireland, and you can basically see that in more intensive grasslands basically dominate our landscape. Only 0.7% of our grasslands are semi-natural, and they're really condensed in places like Leitrim and the Burn and elsewhere. So that was the depressing part, or at least I hope that was the depressing part. I'm going to try and be more upbeat now. So we've lost a lot of biodiversity, but I think in some ways that means that what we have is still extremely precious. And we should be extremely passionate about protecting it and restoring it. So some of the greatest hits of our natural heritage for me would be the fact that we might be a small island nation, but we're actually a mighty ocean state. Our marine territory is 10 times the size of our island. And so a lot of our biodiversity is actually marine biodiversity. And we have incredible species. The biggest species that have ever existed in all history, the blue whale and fin whale, pass through our waters. The second biggest fish in the world, the basking shark, comes to our coastal waters in the summer to feed. We've got dramatic, raucous seabird colonies like the skellig rising out of the sea. We've got fantastical deep sea creatures. Right now, somewhere out there in the deep sea, there's probably a giant squid battling with the sperm whale. How cool is that? We've got one of the largest birds of prey in the world, the white-tailed eagle, is back in Ireland. How incredible are they? We've got species like the freshwater pearl mussel. They can live to be 140 years old. It's hard to comprehend the things that they've witnessed. Mainly water getting increasingly more polluted, but you're a freshwater pearl mussel. You don't have a large brain, so they're probably not that depressed about it. The habitats as well. We've lost a lot of our wetlands. We've still got extensive blanket bogs and wetlands in places like Roundstone and Connemara. We've got extremely rare habitats like raised bogs. So these things have been developing since the end of the last ice age. So for 13,000 years, they've been trapping carbon, stabilizing our climate, pumping out oxygen, supporting biodiversity. These things are ecosystem service providers on steroids, just incredible habitat. So then what are the things that give me hope now when I think about nature restoration potential in Ireland? I think one of the first things are the Irish people, a fantastic group of people. Anytime we've asked the Irish people, do they care about biodiversity, there's been a resounding yes. They always want the government to take action. They always want us to invest more. People want to experience nature more. They want to be part of their lives. People don't want to be listening to people like me talking about biodiversity loss anymore. We want to be focusing on the positives of nature restoration. A great example of this would be the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. So this is when people from around the country were brought together, they were put in a room and they were taught about biodiversity loss in Ireland. They were asked what to think about it and then asked to give some recommendations. Met with some really bold recommendations, extremely critical of the failures of past governments and asking for ambitious nature restoration. Something else that gives me hope is there's always a lot of talk about the divide between environmentalism and farming. But I actually think when you actually engage and see what's happening on the ground. We have some amazing farmers in this country, some of our great farming for nature leaders, and they've shown that when they're actually given the supports, the funding, the right schemes, they're more than willing and able to lead from the front. So Ireland has developed some of the best results-based agri-environmental schemes in the world, and we've seen unprecedented demand for those agri-environmental schemes in recent years, and we've seen that the nature measures within the Common Agricultural Policy are the most popular measures among farmers. So this sort of divide is really something that's created by industry and by the media. Something else that gives me hope is that conservation works. So when we actually do conservation, we tend to get results from it. I'm thinking of things like the Corncrake Life Project, that last summer there was a 25-year high in the number of calling corncrakes. I'm thinking of really successful reintroduction programs we've had, where we brought back white-tailed eagles, we brought back red kites, species that were persecuted to extinction, and now they're doing really well. I'm thinking of species that have recovered, like common buzzard and pine marten, that were down to small little parts of the country and now they've spread back out. And I'm thinking as well about species that have recolonized our country totally without any support from ourselves, like the great spotted woodpecker and the common crane. And the common crane for me is particularly inspiring because they've been absent from Ireland for 400 years. And next thing, Bord na Móna finished harvesting a cutaway bog and it started to rehabilitate. And next thing, the common cranes just appeared of their own volition and started breeding. And that's an extremely powerful metaphor for me about the potential for nature to restore itself if we just take our foot off its throat. Another thing is our laws. So we have some of the best laws in the world as part of the European Union, the Habitats and Birds Directive. We have a network of protected sites that cover 13% of our country already. The biggest issue with those laws is that our governments haven't been implementing them. And that's why the EU came about with the new EU Nature Restoration Law, which was passed last August. Just yesterday, stakeholders were put in a room to start talking about how we can start putting together our National Nature Restoration Plan, which has to be delivered by the government by September 2026. So if you're interested in nature restoration, this is an extremely exciting time to be in Ireland and to be interested in nature restoration. Anya's up on her feet, which means I have run over time, but as I told her, this was just a bonus slide. You can't put an environmental advocate up on a stage and expect me not to make a pitch. I'm extremely passionate, as you might gather, about the potential for nature restoration, and particularly about the potential for nature restoration on public lands. So public lands in Ireland could cover up to 11% of our country, all the coloured areas here. The biggest public lands are the 7% of the country that's owned and managed, I should say, by Creilsha, the semi-state forestry company, and Bord na Móna, the peat mining semi-state, who own or manage 1% of the country. So between the two of them, that's 8% of our country. They're the biggest landowners. This is public land. They're the biggest peatland landowners, extremely significant for both climate perspective and a biodiversity perspective. And yeah, I believe we're asking private landowners, farmers, etc., to do more and more for nature. The state has to lead from the front. It has to be seen to lead from the front. This is public land and it should be managed in the public interest. So that's something that the NGO community in Ireland is going to be campaigning for. And yeah, we hope to see a lot more exciting and ambitious nature restoration projects across the country in the future, but particularly on public land. That's fine.
Congratulations, Fintan. That was pretty epic. 15 minutes, you've covered a lot. A big time scale. You named loads of really crucial key species. You even got into the legislation and the policy thing, which I had promised you would do. Well done. Thanks, Fintan. A bit of a chance for some of the questions. One of the things that struck me is that Ireland is the worst country in the world in terms of the rate of wetland loss specific. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the key drivers about that and what can we do now to address that? Can we reverse that? Or you speak about as well the peatland restoration that we can do.
I think historically a big part of that would have been the loss of our peatlands. So obviously, when Ireland became independent, there was a big push, I suppose, to maximise our resources, as it were. And Bord na Móna were established. They were given a purely commercial mandate. A lot of the raised bogs that they would have been targeting were in the Midlands, quite poor regions of the country. So it was really viewed that peatlands were viewed through the prism of the cutting of turf anyway. They were very much seen as wastelands. They weren't productive landscapes. And so by going out there and harvesting this resource, creating jobs, it was seen as only a positive thing. And it's only really in retrospect I suppose, we're much better off nowadays as a country. And we can look back and see what we've lost, the amazing species we've lost.
Yeah, what are the consequences of that loss?
Yeah,
why does it matter?
Our peatlands should be a massive asset. So particularly from a climate perspective, peatlands, as I said, raised bogs have been developing for 13,000 years. A healthy raised bog will grow at about 1 millimetre a year. And the profile of a bog is mainly a tiny little top layer, which is made of species of moss. Let's generalize and say that. And then the bottom below that moss, it just dies. But because it creates such an acidic environment, that plant matter doesn't decompose. So what you basically get is carbon building up over a long time. And bogs, although they only cover, I think, 4% of the Earth's land area, they store much more carbon than all the forests in the world. So these are amazing habitats. They're doing a great job at stabilizing our climate. But by destroying them, by draining them, by harvesting, and obviously by burning them, we're releasing that carbon back up into the atmosphere. So we're creating a lot of greenhouse gases. But we're also destroying their ability to lock in and store carbon. So we should have a massive asset in our peatlands, but they're actually become a massive liability. So there's actually a process now in Ireland called the Land Use Review, and that's trying to identify how do we address land use emissions from things like, clear felling forestry and peatland loss and other things. And it's a massive issue. It's a huge issue. And it's one that the politicians aren't getting to grasp with at all. And I think the reports, the findings of that land use review are going to come out soon. I think it's really going to shock people.
The land use review, it's not something that's gotten a lot of media coverage. Can you just give us a little synopsis of how it came about, what the process is, and what your hopes are for what it might deliver?
Yeah, I suppose hopes and fears. So I suppose Ireland created a climate law. And then to make that climate law work, there has to be limits on the amount of emissions you can create in the different sectors. So you can think like transport sector, we need to reduce the amount of fossil fuel vehicles, etc. But then there was this awkward area, which is like agriculture land use. So, cattle in particular produce a lot of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. And then as I said, we've got our land use, which is our peatlands, are producing a lot of emissions. So that's been left to last because it's the most politically difficult. And the review so far, it's basically identified that for us to address those emissions, we would have to restore effectively all peatlands in the country. So that would mean an end to all turf cutting. And you can imagine we've been, the last 30 years trying to stop people, sometimes not engaging enough, sometimes not supporting enough, absolutely, to stop turf cutting within a small number of SSE bogs in the country. And now, in a couple of months' time, we're possibly going to come out with a report that says we need to restore all bogs. There's been a lot of talk about re-wetting of farmed peat soils. This report is going to come out and say basically like anything up to 80% of farmed organic soils will have to be re-wetted to some extent. So this is really dramatic stuff, and it's going to cause a real uproar. But these are issues we need to grapple with, and the kinds of things, the way we're managing our land isn't working. It's not really working for the majority of farmers either, which isn't really recognised.
I know you've been involved in a lot of campaigns. I've been involved in similar campaigns, and peatlands is a really controversial topic in that people get very, very upset when we're taking away, we as in the conservationists, politicians are taking away their right to cut turf that they've always done. And then when we look at agricultural farmed peatland as well, that is now grassland, that's very, very tricky. I imagine that the communications is going to be a massive part of that.
Yeah, my grandfather actually owned a turbary right on an SSE bog, so I get it in the neck all the time. I can't even go to weddings without getting in the neck. So it's the communications challenge is real for me, and it doesn't end when I stop working. Definitely not.
Yeah. Is that going to be dealt with in the land use review?
Well, we have a new government, and I would say it's fair to say that new government is less progressive than the last one. Christopher O'Sullivan from Fianna Fáil he's the best we could have had for nature. But in general, I would say it's less progressive. And for the stakeholders that were in that process came to a very abrupt end. So we would have been saying this is so controversial. We need an ongoing process for years. We need to be talking about this.
We've had the Peatlands Council. We've had a huge amount of processes. We've had a huge amount of policy to address these issues. And so far, there hasn't been a great deal of progress. There's been small pockets of progress. But do you think this might be a gear change in our response?
It's going to light a fire under people. It's going to force conversations, definitely. These emissions aren't going away. We're accountable to international agreements. We should be accountable to our own national laws. So I think I worked heavily on the campaign with our partners within IEN Sustainable Water Network to try and get the nature restoration law passed. And the re-wetting targets within that, which are just a tiny little bit, they disproportionately impact the whole national conversation. So it's and those targets within the nature restoration law are just a fraction of what the kind of climate side of things is saying we need to do. So it's hard for me to say what the reaction will be, because it would be massive.
Can I have a show of hands who's heard of the nature restoration law? That's nearly everybody. Fantastic. Okay.
What an informed audience.
And what about the Birds and Habitats Directive? Almost everybody, not quite as much. One of the things that I find fascinating about the nature restoration law is that we've had these birds and habitats directives. They are like cutting edge, the best environmental laws ever in existence, I would say, covering protected areas right across Europe. And they haven't really been as effective as they were designed to be. They've definitely made progress, but there's been massive issues in implementing the birds and the habitat. Do you think that we're going to get a bit further now with the nature restoration law? And in what way is the nature restoration law different to the Birds and Habitats Directive?
I'm a massive nerd for this stuff, so environmental legislation. My favourite part about the nature restoration law is that it clearly identifies this implementation gap. So there's an Article 4 that looks at the habitats and species that are covered by the Habitats Directive, and then as well the Birds Directive, and then there's Article 5 that looks at the marine species that are protected currently, but then even goes beyond that, recognising that we haven't had enough protection of marine habitats. And it basically establishes incremental targets and timelines, because it seems if you go to governments and say, you have to restore this habitat, but there's no timeline, they go, great, that's a great idea, we're going to do that, and it never happens. So
timelines are one of the key differences.
This is a huge thing, and it also recognises that our understanding of the connection between climate action, nature restoration, with the role of habitats as well, that's there. It's basically, it's really a catch-all for all sorts of things, urban greening, improving biodiversity on farmland, in forestry. Pollinators get a whole article. which was great. It was actually the only part of the nature restoration law that was strengthened. It turns out the far right in Europe really like pollinate. They don't like banning pesticides, but they like adapting targets that would imply you should ban pesticides, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But the far right in general are a bit scattered. So
well done. There's one more thing just before we wrap up that I want to ask you about, and that's the Common Agricultural Policy. So this is another major piece of legislation and policy that's across Europe, and it probably has more influence on biodiversity, on bird populations, on water quality, even on climate emissions from land use than all of the other environmental laws put together. How much are you engaged with Common Agricultural Policy, and what do you think the potential is for the Common Agricultural Policy to get serious about addressing biodiversity loss, water quality?
Yeah, like I'd say as a network, we're very engaged in the Common Agricultural Policy. It's one of the most impactful policies ever for biodiversity, for water quality, for climate in Ireland. So we're involved in various stakeholder forums. I would say I'm a bit concerned, to be honest. I think a lot of what's happening in the world isn't helpful. You know, we've had Brexit. There was a reduction in the EU's budget. The Common Agricultural Policy is a big part of that EU budget. So there's pressure within that. We need more money to restore nature. There's a big pushback from farmers. They, I suppose, understandably say you can't pay us to do X, Y, and Z and then add on a whole bunch of other stuff for the same money. So we really need additional money. And with
are the links being drawn between nature restoration law and Common Agricultural Policy?
Yes, I would say that, you know, basically the law implies that you have to work within the Common Agricultural Policy. The Common Agricultural Policy has to be aligned with those targets because it's always been aligned with the Habitats and Birds Directives. So you can't now create a law that's a big part of it's about implementing those and say, well, there's not going to be any connectivity. Things like there's targets for increasing habitats and farms. There's the pollinator target. Like, you can't have a Common Agricultural Policy that goes against those things. Well, you can and we have, but we definitely shouldn't.
Okay. So for me, it's really amazing to hear about so many, hopefully for the audience as well, there are so many really strong legislative instruments that will help biodiversity, but it's a matter of implementing them properly. It's a matter of having good civil society engagement in those. It's a matter of having funding to implement the things that we need to do. So I wish you in the Environmental Network, the Irish Environmental Network, and all the member organisations a lot of luck, and I hope that people can get involved as well and support all of those organisations who are immersed in the policy front line of work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fintan.
Yeah.